Waymo, which is a company owned by Google, is planning a fleet of self-driving, all-electric robo-taxis with Chinese automaker Geely. Now, before we get into this news, I want to jump into some background on Waymo. I think it's safe to say when we think of EV companies, and especially when we think of self-driving vehicles, Tesla comes to mind. Tesla and Elon Musk absorb the huge majority of EV news and coverage and all the attention. Now, there might be some other stocks and companies that absorb some attention at some point, like Rivian or Ford or some other companies going into EVs, but I don't think that Google's one of the companies that comes to mind. It's usually not the first one you think about when you think about EV or self-driving vehicles. I believe this is mostly because Waymo, the EV portion of Google, is overshadowed by their other massive businesses. And I think this may be a mistake that investors are making. I think that Waymo may have the potential to be a huge player in the EV market. Waymo has been studying self-driving technology for over a decade. They're not new to this game. This is something they've been working on for a while. Here's a report from the Wall Street Journal talking about Waymo's efforts into self-driving.
San Francisco provides a wide diversity of not only geography, but also a diversity of the kind of interactions that we'll have on the road itself.
So you can see we're in a little bit of a busier part of the neighborhood here. There are cars parked along the right. There's a truck here stopped unloading.
Waymo rides in San Francisco, like the one the company invited the Wall Street Journal to take, are currently done with a driver at the wheel. But the company says it's the tech aboard its vehicles that are making a majority of the decisions.
So right now they're testing Waymo in San Francisco. And they mentioned that although people are at the wheel during these tests, the tech itself is making most of the decisions. And here's the tech they have attached to these vehicles.
The tech that I can actually see here, what are the main components?
The lidar, which is the 360 degree at the top.
Now, the first piece of tech he mentions on the Waymo vehicle is a very controversial one called lidar. It's controversial because Elon Musk thinks that it's essentially worthless to have on EVs.
And this
LiDAR's lame. LiDAR is lame.
Musk says that lidar is lame, and he goes on to give a prediction for companies like Waymo that are currently using lidar.
If that is true, what happens to the rest of the industry that's building their autonomy solutions on lidar?
They're all going to dump LiDAR. That's my prediction. Mark my words.
He thinks they'll eventually scrap it, and he's been saying this for some time, but so far companies like Google have not scrapped lidar. They're still using it, even after he's been saying this for about a year or two. Now, Tesla goes on to explain why you don't need lidar, how you can capture all the information necessary with just cameras. And their basic summary of this is saying, that's how our eyes work. That's how humans work. They just capture visuals, and humans can make all the assessments and adjustments and judgment just based off of a visual camera.
At least two sensors in the car. One is vision, cameras, just getting pixels, and the other is lidar that a lot of companies also use. And lidar gives you these point measurements of distance around you. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, first of all, is you all came here, you drove here, many of you, and you used your neural net and vision. You were not shooting lasers out of your eyes, and you still ended up here.
We might have.
So things went well.
Can't speak for everyone.
So clearly, the human neural net derives distance and all the measurements and the 3D understanding of the world just from vision. It actually uses multiple cues to do so. I'll just briefly go over some of them, just to give you a sense of roughly what's going on inside. As an example, we have two eyes pointed out.
He goes on to explain how you can gain all the necessary depth perception and visual rendering of your surroundings just by your eyes and the distance that they're apart. And they're basically mimicking that with the cameras. So in Tesla's view, you don't really need lidar. It's an unnecessary thing, and it's not as good as just having the visuals. But for whatever reason, Waymo doesn't agree with this. They're still continuing with lidar. But luckily for Waymo, this isn't the only tech that they include.
The smaller ones around the side, the perimeter lidar. We have cameras, 29 different cameras positioned throughout the vehicle, and radar is our third kind. Within that trunk is where we have the majority of our compute systems.
So they also include, like Tesla's, 29 different cameras on the vehicle. It's a lot of different cameras, and they include radar. So I think the Waymo version of doing this is saying, let's just include all of it, and then we can mesh the data together to make a more comprehensive understanding of our surroundings. And that way, maybe they can get the best that each of these individual pieces of tech can offer. Now, with all this tech, like I've said, they've been running real tests for a long time.
Right now, Waymo's driving us around a pretty residential area, lots of stop signs, no stoplights on the route so far. I think seeing the supporting driver's hands hovering and sometimes grabbing the wheel itself is providing a little bit of additional security for me. Waymo really likes to stick to the speed limit.
Last week, a Waymo car hit a pedestrian in San Francisco. The company said the vehicle was being driven by a human driver in manual mode when it struck the pedestrian.
The unfortunate thing about this news of this Waymo vehicle hitting this pedestrian is I think there's a good chance this would have been avoided if it wasn't in manual mode. If it was the Waymo system in control, I bet you the lidar or the cameras or the radar, one of the three would have picked up that there's a pedestrian and hit the brakes. Now they do mention that Waymo's not the only one using this tech. There's a lot of different companies doing this right now.
So far, 7 companies, including Waymo and Cruise, have received permits from the state to test autonomous vehicles without a driver. But Waymo wants to be the first to offer its service to the public.
How far off do you think you are from being able to pull the autonomous specialists from the vehicle?
Our current focus is really continuing to develop a safe and convenient experience for all of our riders. So no specific timelines to share at this time.
So I think that Google and Waymo give a different approach than Elon Musk and Tesla. They don't give out these big timelines or predictions. I think they like being in the background and doing this on their own timeline. So by Google doing all of this a little bit more discreet, they're not tweeting about it, they're not giving out big timelines, they're not on the investing news cycle 24/7, and I think that this has given investors a false impression that Google's really not a big player in the EV market. And I think that Google's Waymo very well could be a force to be reckoned with in the future EV and robotaxi market. They're testing these things all around San Francisco. This is a major US city, it's densely populated, and it's one of the most popular places for Uber and Lyft.
Success in San Francisco could help provide a revenue-generating business for Waymo. Analysts estimate its cars cost $200,000, and it can't yet charge passengers for rides in the city.
They don't need to operate a robotaxi fleet in a ton of markets because if you look at the business performance and results of Uber and Lyft, they mostly come from just a handful of cities around the world, like 10 cities.
What he's saying here is completely accurate. Waymo doesn't need a robotaxi network to operate everywhere in the US. They only need it to work in about 10 major US cities that would encompass the huge majority of ride sharing. Waymo is actually so advanced with their tech specific to some cities that they're literally operating right now without drivers.
A 50 square mile area around Chandler, Arizona. Here, Waymo has pulled the driver support, and riders can now hail robotaxis themselves.
The wheel is moving by itself.
Now to me this seems like Google's Waymo is taking this very seriously. This is a major project for them. Now to add to that news, we also have recent news that Waymo seems like they've picked out at least one manufacturer to partner with. It's a Chinese automaker named Geely, a company I've never heard of before. And they're taking a different approach than Tesla. They're not manufacturing high performance vehicles, they're manufacturing minivans. Now these are just concept images, but they should be pretty close to what's actually manufactured. You can see that it has a futuristic feel to it, but it still looks somewhat like a minivan. I think what Waymo's doing here is they're really going for the robo-taxi, not the driverless, self-driving vehicle. They're going for the robo-taxi network. And as such, they want it to feel like a passenger-only vehicle. And minivans are perfect for passenger-only vehicles. The sliding doors are much easier for both kids, elderly people, and adults to get in and out of. They never bump into other vehicles, and it's much easier to climb in and out of the vehicles. They're also, generally speaking, more comfortable to ride. And I think when it really comes down to it, people that just want to ride from point A to point B don't really care about the looks of the vehicle. They want a quiet, comfortable ride in a safe vehicle. But there's one particular thing that I noticed about the mock-up of the interior. If you look at the front row seats, there's no driving mechanisms at all in the vehicle. It seems that Google views this the same way as Apple. They view the steering wheel and the pedals as just unnecessary clutter inside the vehicle. We know from insider reports that this is the exact approach that Apple's taking.
Well, that's what Apple does, right? They only enter new product categories when they're able to come out with the leapfrog product. You saw that with the original iPhone. You saw that with the iPad. You saw that with the Apple Watch. Now it's the car's turn, and they want to release something that really no one else has really been successfully able to nail, and that's what they're doing for this. That's how it's been described to me. They really want to create a car that's a hands-free experience. They're redesigning the interior and exterior around the idea of having a car with no wheels or pedals.
Now that sounds great from Apple, but it seems like Google might beat them to it. Now this is the extent of what we know so far. This entire market evolves over time, but as of right now, I consider Google to be one of the biggest players and one of the biggest contenders in the EV space and robotaxi space. And it's one that I'm going to be paying close attention to.